I break down the 4 most popular and dominant compositions currently on ladder, and also 4 variations and underplayed compositions so you can climb infinite LP. And by the way, if you're looking for legend recommendations based on the composition, check out my legends tier list over at metatft.com/legends. Let's start off with Azir Strategist, the comp that I think is the strongest in the game, assuming you're able to hit everything on time and you're able to cap out. The 3 priority things for Azir is 1, make sure you're always slamming good items. 2, make sure you're preserving enough HP and gold so you can roll at 7. And 3, make sure you're picking the right combat augments to enhance your composition strength. The best early game slam for Azir generally is Static Shiv because it's able to preserve a lot of HP, but you can also slam Rage Blade as well. So bow is very, very crucial and probably one of the first components that you'll be picking on the carousel. This is the current state of what it looks like to be rolling on 7 specifically. A lot of people end up playing Teemo at 7, when in reality, he should be something that you play at level 8 because you really want to focus on your front line. Even a unit like Garen, even though he doesn't have any items, is really important for synergy because a lot of times he can give you that radiant item on Jarvan or a Lux, so you can get that extra damage and burst, and not to mention a little bit extra tankiness for your front line. It's important to understand that this composition has a mixture of both high burst at the very beginning of the fight because of things like Lux, and ramping because of things like the Shurima trait, as well as Azir holding items like Rage Blade and Archangel Staff. You might notice that there's things like Spark on the Noxus and Shiv on the Azir. You only need one or the other. So for example, if you did have that Spark on Noxus, instead of playing for Shiv, I would instead go for something like Archangel Staff on Azir, so I have a lot more AP sources. The 2 most important units to position in this composition are Jarvan and Lux. Jarvan's a really important carry to position on usually the extremes because you want him to hit a large clump of enemies, and especially the corner carry that needs to ramp, like the Aphelios or the Kaisa. Oftentimes you end up putting Jarvan usually A2 or A6. Lux's positioning is really dependent on where the enemy tank is because you want to eliminate them as fast as possible. The thing that people don't think about with Lux a lot of times is the second half of her ability, which is reducing their magic resistance every second. That means that units that hold things like D-Claw and whatnot are not actually going to be very impactful, so make sure that Lux tries to get past those tanks as fast as possible. If you have Azir stuck on a tank instead, you're going to be really, really sad. Sometimes you even put things like Lux in the middle here so that you can snipe really valuable units. Let's say they keep Baron Nashor in the front center. Try to have that Lux on that unit as fast as possible so you can kill it. This also applies to hyper carry frontline melee carries. Let's say people are playing a Darius, for example. You want to same side the Lux and try to get onto Darius as quickly as possible. Let's talk about the buildup of how we're able to get to level 7 safely with a lot of HP and gold. So I think the best opener, in my opinion, is to play around Void and Sorcerers of some capacity. Malzahar is actually one of the strongest one costs that you can play around currently when it's AP. He can hold almost any set of AP items. So you can give him things like the Shojin, you can give him something like Shiv, and he'll definitely do really well with it. If you have the opportunity to slam Spark, I actually highly recommend Spark as well, and then you don't even have to have Shiv. Instead, you can have Shojin, maybe play for like JG. Don't forget that some of the best early game AP items that you can have is Spark and Sunfire. It just does so much damage, and oftentimes these items will carry you regardless of who's holding it. From here, you can start building out. Like for example, in level 5, you can add Teemo, so you can get Strategist. Let's say you find Vel'Koz, and now all of a sudden your Cho'Gath, which is still 1-star, you can play this instead. And then on level 6, you can add Taric. Remember to put Taric between 2 units because he buffs adjacent units with his shields. Another positioning tip, have Malzahar 1 hex from the corner, so that way he can hit as many units as possible. Sometimes when Malzahar is in the corner, he hits 1 target at best, so you want to make sure to try to maximize that surface area. And when you're getting ready to transition, you already are holding units like Talia, for example, so you just replace Vel'Koz with Talia, you replace Kassadin, let's say you hit the Jarvan finally, and then you're able to hit Azir. You sell Malzahar, and then you find another Shurima unit. Let's say for whatever reason, you're just stuck playing Renekton instead. And there you go, a level 7 that you can totally play without necessarily having to hit everything. A lot of people are focused on hitting the Nasus and the Jarvan and the Azir and the Lux, but that's 4 costs, and that's really, really expensive. So set your expectations to try to stabilize with this composition first before you're able to actually go into the late stages of the game. Let's say that you're rolling on 7 and you want to keep rolling at 7 because it looks like your board isn't stable enough. You finally hit Lux. What do you replace? Take out that Teemo immediately, put Lux in. Because you have the sorcerers already connected, you can take out Taric and try to tech in any kind of Demacian unit. A lot of times people are going for Garen, but let's say instead you find Galio. Galio can totally just be a temporary frontline unit. And hey, maybe you're not necessarily hitting Renekton. Instead, you have a Cassiopeia, and now all of a sudden you linked with Invokers. So there's definitely a handful of ways that you can kind of build around the board if you're not hitting the ideal units. But eventually you want to replace things like Cassio because she's not particularly very strong, especially at this stage of the game. you hit Nasus instead. And remember that Garen is often the Juggernaut that you want to link in because the Juggernaut HP is very good. You can also separate Garen at times because remember he spins AoE, so you get more value based off him being isolated. And then we introduced Teemo back at level 8. We'll start with some augments that are really strong in this composition in particular. You're looking at one long distance pals, which is usually tied to Lux and Azir. Sometimes you can put it on a frontliner if you really want to, but in general with a dual carry setup like this, long distance pals is usually ideal. You get a bunch of ramping ability power when you play things like Archangel Staff as well, so make sure to keep an eye out for that. If you can get to 5 Strategists, it is very, very strong. Gives you a lot of durable frontline and backline mix. I think Ascension is also really, really strong because you're trying to ramp and really leans into the Shurima aspect of things. So you have the Lux to burst, but then after 15 seconds, the follow-up cast from both Azir and Lux will hit really, really hard. In general, a lot of other things like AP or Gifts of the Fallen or healing is also pretty strong in this composition, so don't sleep on that. The other really popular comp that people are spamming right now is Ionia Challenger, where you focus on Yasuo and Kai'Sa as your main damage dealers. A lot of times you're playing exactly these 8 units because you want to maximize the Ionia bonuses and you want to maximize the Challenger attack speed. The really cool thing about Ionia as well is that you pretty much have a use of every single item set. If you have 80 items, they go on Yasuo. Attack speed items or AP items can go on Kai'Sa or Karma. Tank items go on Shen, and then utility items can go on anybody else. The other thing that's really nice about Ionia is that you're positionally very flexible. You're able to actually play around a lot of those portals that have hexes that give bonuses, for example. Also, if you're playing really strong and annoying augments like Mana Burn, you have so many use cases of it because it doesn't really matter where you put units like Warwick, for example. The level 8 board usually looks like this. Actually, instead of Jhin, a lot of times you play Ahri as the high cap, but Jhin usually gets you there. You'll also notice that my priority list is pretty much the exact same thing, and this is why people think this tree is particularly strong, is because you're ultimately prioritizing the same 3 things, which is make good AP items early so you can stabilize and play around Kai'Sa. Make sure you go for a strong level 7 roll down so you can stabilize your board, and then go for the maximum amount of combat augments that you can allow to make sure to boost your combat strength. One thing I want to shout is that I think Karma 3 in Ionia is pretty underrated, and the thing about this comp is that you're likely super contested, so you often have to make a contingency plan if you're not hitting Kai'Sa 2 and Yasuo 2. So for example, if you're stuck rolling on 7 for a really long time, instead of trying to chase for Kai'Sa and Yasuo, you hold on to Karma and start transitioning some AP items to Karma instead. Let's say you don't want to play around Kai'Sa because you're not hitting her. Instead, you have an opportunity to play around Callista, who's actually the best holder of Ionia Emblem. So if you have Ionia Emblem, make sure to tag it onto Callista. And then Callista really wants not just attack speed, but also some damage amplification. So Giant Slayer helps her get past a bunch of tanks. Dual Gauntlet is actually particularly really good on Callista as well, but let's say you're not able to do that because you slammed the Rage Blade, you can go ahead and play Rage Blade on Callista as well. Another incredible user of Ionia Emblem is Bel'Veth. Bel'Veth is actually disgusting with attack speed. And so in fact, it's actually not incorrect to just give her things like Rapid Fire Cannon on top of the Ionia and then a Giant Slayer so she can bust tanks. If you end up playing things like the Bel'Veth and you don't need that extra challenger, you can just go ahead and take out this Warwick and replace it with any unit that seems really solid. Say for example, you hit Aatrox. Aatrox is a pretty solid champion to play around on the new patch. Make sure to position Aatrox on the same side as Yasuo so that way he gets the Darken bonus. And if you're not hitting Ahri, instead, why not check in Gwen? Gwen is actually a pretty solid champion to play within the Ionia tree because of the link to Callista in particular. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the video. The initial buildup is very simple. You want to just try to play around Irelia, Set, and Jhin as your core Ionia units. Sometimes if you don't have Set, you just play Zed. If you end up playing around Zed instead because you have that as your tempo option, just go ahead and play Viego. Viego is still one of the strongest one cost to play around if you can 2-star alongside Jhin. Both of these units deal immense damage. Deathblade can go on Jhin, for example, slam things like Spark and AP items on Viego. Generally, I still recommend going through Set because he still unlocks really important aspects of Juggernaut and Challenger through Warwick. And then level 5, you basically try to just add in anything that synergizes really well with your board. It doesn't really matter if you end up playing a 3rd Challenger, for example, with Samira. My favorite unit to also play around on 5 is Ashe because I think it's really good for the Deadeye. Plus, Ashe has a really good amount of utility with the attack speed slow in the beginning of the fight. You guys want to make your opponents cringe? Positioning for Ashe is actually a little bit funny sometimes because you can move your front line a little bit off center. Notice that's how it's a little bit slanted to the right. This is because when Ashe shoots, her arrow is more likely to hit the back line now because the front line units are wrapping around units like this Warwick instead. So you're going to be attack speed slowing their backline and once again almost bringing back Frozen Heart Assassins in the early game. At level 6, you want to try to get to 4 challengers, so you hit that Callista finally, taking back that Samira. Callista has a really high amount of base attack speed, so she holds things like this Shiv, for example, as well as the other AP items. And as much as you want to prioritize all the damage items in the world, especially if you're taking item-based augments to start off the game, is that you really want to make sure your frontline is really solid. Do not ignore frontline items. Things like Vow, Sunfire Cape, and Warmogs are still really strong items to play around, and sometimes sometimes maybe you just have a really tanky Irelia and that carries you alongside just the damage that you get through things like the challengers and Jhin. So now we reached the level 7 board, which actually has two variations that people really like to play. The first is just to go as many Ionia as you can and try to hit 6. A lot of times you're rolling for things like the Shen, you hit the Karma, and finally Yasuo. Cut Samira. And as mentioned before, the Callista spot could be Kai'Sa or Callista because you have the ability to carry both. If you hit the Ionia emblem, make sure you put it on the Callista so that way she gets the attack speed. But if you don't have an Ionia emblem, no problem, just play Kai'Sa instead. A lot of people put Ionia emblem on Kai'Sa, but the reality is it's mediocre because Ionia emblem just gives a bunch of attack speed, which is what you have through Challenger. You want to make sure to amplify that through damage. Remember, if you have a bunch of one kind of stat, whether it's a bunch of ability power, a bunch of attack damage, a bunch of attack speed, you want other categories of damage so you can multiply them together for a bigger amount of DPS. The Kai'Sa is quite mediocre with the Ionia emblem. Just stack a bunch of stats on her. So you're thinking about like Giant Slayer, JG, you can do Archangel Staff, Gunblade. Shiv is also particularly good because she has a bunch of attack speed. Get that Deathblade instead onto Yasuo somehow. Item remover, sell Jhin, find another Ionia unit. Get that Deathblade on Yasuo. That's really, really important, as well as Edge of Night. A lot of times people actually try to prioritize Edge of Night first on Yasuo. I'm pretty sure Deathblade is a little bit better, and then Edge of Night becomes important as the game continues to progress. But both are really important, so try to go for both of them if you can. I mentioned a second variation. Instead of going for 6 Ionia, you can play vertical challengers instead. The nice thing about vertical challengers is that you're not actually changing your board too much already. At level 7, you're pretty much just rolling for 2 units, which is Kai'Sa and Yasuo. So you hit Kai'Sa, she goes into here, and then Jhin comes out, Yasuo in. And voila, now you actually just have a much easier board to hit without having to rely on a full transition to hit things like Karma and Shen in order to transition to that Ionia. If you go for Callista 3-star, Shiv is actually not particularly really strong in that instance because you're relying on her damage. So you want to get her going with things like the Rage Blade and the Giant Slayer. And this is a board that you can roll for at 7 for a long time. Hit Kai'Sa, Yasuo 2, and Callista, and you'll be quite stable. Keep in mind, this composition is often playing for like a top 4 placement instead of a top 2 because you're probably going to be stuck at 7 for a long time, and this is not your primary game plan. If you do hit a Challenger emblem, though, you're able to, for example, cut Samira and play Gwen. And this Gwen can hold the Challenger emblem instead. And you'd be surprised how well and effective she can be, particularly because it almost feels like she never has any downtime of walking because she'll be dashing through the Challenger bonus. A couple things about positioning. Make sure that Yasuo is protected by whoever's the tankiest unit. So if it's a tanky Irelia or tanky Set, you want to put the Irelia and Set where Shen is right now. This is because you want Yasuo to not get targeted. As soon as this unit dies in front of him, the next closest unit will pick up the aggression, aka Yasuo. Even though Yasuo is safe with Edge of Night for the first time, you don't want to activate the untargetable shed effect until later in the fight. The longer you can stall for it, the more powerful that becomes in late game scenarios. Let's talk about augments for a little bit. Buried Treasures is particularly really good in Ionia because you want to itemize multiple carries and multiple frontline units if you possibly can to get all those Ionia bonuses. Remember, the Ionia bonus goes on whoever's the strongest, aka who's holding the most items, and then star level, and then rarity. Because you're playing a lot of 4 cost, just keep in mind how Kai'Sa, Yasuo, and Shen are going to juggle those Ionia bonuses because they're really, really powerful. Don't forget, combat augments like Sentinel Spears for Ionia are really, really strong in particular because it gives you a bunch of that attack speed with the challengers. And I already preemptively positioned what social distancing looks like because you want those flat stats to amplify the attack speed that you get. Let's talk about AD's role in the meta currently because a lot of AP compositions are on top. If you want to play Aphelios or Zeri, you have to be first adjusting your expectation. You're playing for a top 4. You're not usually playing to win the game unless you're able to really cap out your board early and play from ahead. Or if you hit something crazy like a 3-star Aphelios because no one's really buying this unit. The most important item that you can start off with is Rage Blade because it's good early and it's really important for these AD carries to have attack speed. And then combo with some kind of AD item. A lot of times it's Deathblade, but sometimes you have to go with whatever's best like an Infinity Edge or a Giant Slayer. A lot of times you'll be looking for the Freljord Shell because this gives you an opportunity to not have to play Last Whisper because Freljord will already give you that Sundering to reduce armor. If you do not have an armor reduction source, you will bot 4. So make sure that if for whatever reason you can't find the Freljord because you're just not finding those units, try to play a Last Whisper source. Maybe just a god. If you don't have Freljord for whatever reason, let's say Lysandra and Sejuani are just not here, you can play Heimerdinger for the potential shred if you're able to get the things like the Shrink module. The nice thing about Shrink module, by the way, is that I think double stacking it is particularly good, and then you can go for things like a Mechanoswarm, so you have a little bit of anti-heal. Dialing back into the core set of the composition, notice that I have Aphelios Akshan or Zeri Jace. It's usually one or the other. You're obviously not trying to play all of those units in the same composition. Aphelios and Akshan tie in really easily because you have the 4 Deadeye, and the more sources of raw AD that you have, or even items, the better it usually gets. But if you, let's say you don't have a lot of AD items, you're struggling, you don't have the item augments, and you just have one set of AD items, you can play Zeri and Jace instead. Overall, I would say that Zeri caps a little bit higher because instead of Jace, you can actually play for Senna. And Senna currently is one of the best units in the game. However, the nice thing about playing Aphelios and Akshan is that you can actually roll for the board at 7 for a really long time. Let's just say this is your board and you're rolling at 7. You also have other outs of things like rolling for Akshan 3-star instead when you're stuck at 7 and you can't actually do anything else. If you're stuck at 7 and rolling for Akshan 3, a lot of times you're just trying to play for a top 4. If you want to play Akshan to actually win the game, you probably have to go for a vertical Shurima, which we'll explain later in this video. The second thing that you want to think about with this composition is rolling a little bit later than everybody else that's rolling for the contested Azir Lux Kaisa comps. This is because if you wait one round, let's say you roll at 4-2 instead of 4-1, not only will you be able to rack up a little bit more interest gold, but they're going to be pulling out all those Kaisas and Yasuos and the Azir and Luxes and Jarvans out of the shops, and you'll be able to more likely hit your units. By the way, I put Shen here. Feel free to just put another Bruiser temporarily. Sometimes I just play like Rek'Sai. My god, this comp is expensive. Let's talk about build up. A lot of times you're going to build around a Deadeye core, and we mentioned this previously. If you have the Ionia start, if you have Irelia set, Jhin, Ashe, Rageblade, Deathblade, really powerful core. From there you add Warwick, so you have the Juggernaut and Challenger. At 6, you can tech in your first Freljord through a Lissandra, and this is a possible way that you can get to level 7. This is a potential other way to start if you don't find any Jhins. You can just go ahead and play around Viego as your item holder with Rageblade. Viego's really likely to stay in the fight because of Rogue, and you'll be able to snipe a lot of backline units to preserve HP. Say level 5, you add in the Callisto, so you get the Shadow Eyes and the Challengers. And then at level 6, maybe you hit that Warwick. Then let's just say you want to go into the 4 Challenger instead. Maybe you hit that early Yasuo, you get the Ionia and the Challenger that way, and you can move the Rageblade over the Callista. Or if you don't hit the Yasuo, you can go ahead and just play Samira. And this is how you can get to level 7, so you can roll for that Aphelios board. But as you notice, that this might as well just lean you back into the Ionia line because you're just playing so many of those units, and that's where the flex is. You can choose to play Rageblade, Deathblade, play around Callista Yasuo, or you can do Rageblade Deathblade and play around Aphelios and Zeri. Say you hit none of those things and you get Akshan out of a box, you can totally play around Akshan as well. Give him the Rageblade and the Deathblade to start things off. And just build around his synergies. You can just play Shurima Bruiser with Cassio. Cassio is also pretty good if you have like early Sunfire, for example, and then you're using that burn damage for that twin thing. Or instead of Cassio, maybe you hit that Jhin, you get that Deadeye. Ashe is actually probably better, so if you want to play around the Ashe. And then at level 5, you can tech in the Shurima. Another underrated unit is Soraka. Let's say you don't get this Akshan and you're just stuck with Cassio, Soraka. I'm pretty confident that Soraka is actually really good with Rageblade early game, so you can just play this kind of board and then make sure you just play around Taric. This looks like a board that actually won't do very much, but you'd be surprised. The Soraka is able to heal the front line and get a lot of synergy with the Targon, and then Cassio, because you have things like the Sunfire Cape, which you want to put on the same side, will actually generate a lot of damage. And then at level 6, maybe you find that Akshan and you can finally start teching back into him, and instead of Soraka, you start going into the usual Freljord stuff. The point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of different early game board variations that you can play, so just try to play around whatever is the strongest unit that you have early. Whatever you 2-star, just try to play around that. Common augments or anything that buffs your flat AD, so social distancing is particularly really good because you can just space out your front line, like so. There you go, I socially distanced. And the reason why this is good is because the Deadeye effect is every 3 seconds they just attack the enemy. So if you just have a lot of high AD and put a lot of items on your Deadeyes, they will most likely one-shot the enemy carries, especially if they're not 2-starred. And don't forget that not only just combat augments, but item augments can be really good as well. One of my favorite item augments to play around is All That Shimmers. One of my favorite items for All That Shimmers is Draven's Axe if you're able to start off with Rageblade, because then you're able to combo and get a lot of that gold, snowball your lead, have that large AD source, and instead of having Deathblade, you can have that Draven's Axe. And then there's also some really powerful stuff, like if you hit Diamond Hands or you hit the Mogul's Mail, those are the top 3 items that I want to play around with this comp. At level 8, make sure you just play more frontline because you ultimately just want to stall and ramp up things like this Rageblade and get more Deadeye procs. And frontline can be just whatever, really. You don't have to necessarily play Sion and Shen, even though they're really easy units. Let's say you just hit a Jarvan 2 because they're just uncontested. All of a sudden, you're just playing a Jarvan 2. Or maybe you just have Shen and then you hit Cassante, so you can just play like a little Bastion frontline to go with your Sejuani. I put TG on Urgot, but in reality, he kind of wants the same exact things as well. He kind of wants like Yasuo items because he's a Deadeye and he's going to auto a lot of those champions and potentially kill them. But I just put TG there because you just don't get that many items in the game. The last of the most popular compositions that you'll be seeing this patch will probably be around Noxus Slayer's Flex. And the flex is who wants to carry, and you usually want to pick 2. The combinations are Zed Kled, Zed Katarina, Zed Darius, or Darius Cat. Priority number one, win early rounds if you're playing Noxus. Those Noxus stacks are super early, and the later you get them, the farther you are behind. It's not that you have to win streak. If you get 30% in stage 2, that's still good enough. Just don't be in the situation where you have like 10 to 20%. If you are lose streaking early, do not try to play any Noxus carry. Instead, your best out will be Zed. Zed is not a Noxus unit, so just play around the Ionia core for him, and then you'll end up having a really strong carry into a 6 Slayer board. Zed's Ionia bonus is crit damage, so you want to put something like Infinity Edge on him. Give him that Titan so that 6 Slayer can help Omnivamp and heal him back up. Quicksilver is also particularly good, so that way he doesn't get CC chained. If you can't get QSS, you can totally put something like Bloodthirster on him. A Hand of Justice is also really good. And the same kind of applies to almost every unit. Every unit in this composition wants one source of healing, one source of damage, and one source of defensiveness. In the case of Darius, the Slayer emblem could also be a Hand of Justice and a Bloodthirster. Titan's Resolve is really good for the defensiveness, and the Infinity Edge is really good for the damage amp. Katarina's a little bit more specific. She just wants damage and healing, so Ionic Spark, Hand of Justice, and Slayer Emblem is really good. Instead of the Slayer Emblem, you can go for Dual Gauntlet, for example, or maybe just flat AP. Led's items are pretty specific. He wants QSS Titans plus a healing source, so either Bloodthirster or Hand of Justice. And then you want to roll at 6. Rolling on 6 is twofold. One, you want to roll on 6 to stabilize your board and hit all those 2-stars. So you're looking at Kled, Zed, Darius, Katarina. You want to hit those 2-star units as fast as you can. And then you want to eco back up to 50 gold again, and then roll all your extra gold above 50 to try and get 3-star Zed and Kled, or potentially even Katarina and Darius. So rolling at 6 and staying at 6 is something you should consider, but you only stay at level 6 if you are rolling for 2-cost 3-stars. If you're rolling for 3-star 3-cost, then you want to go to level 7. Remember that the odds don't improve that much by going from level 6 to 7, though. You go from 30 to 35%. So if you want to roll for Zed and Katarina and Kled, you want to instead stay at 6 because your odds are much more favorable. Plus, you're not investing all of that gold into going to 7. Let's talk about build-up. I think a lot of people will end up playing around Kale because of the Slayer tag, but I want to let you know, don't do that. Kale is still a very weak unit and does not end up helping your early game if you rely upon her, because she gets better at level 6. That's when she starts becoming a real carry that you can potentially play around. But until level 6, you're not going to get that bonus power. Therefore, you're not likely to win those early game rounds. Instead, you want to play around the Noxus. And this is why, ideally, you don't really want to play this unless you start off with Katarina or Darius. Ideally, both, if you're able to get somehow both of these champions. Try to take in that Zed if you can. And finally, some kind of Noxus unit. Cassiopeia is fine. But if you don't find Zed, instead you can play around Viego and then play around another Noxus unit. Let's say you hit the Darius, no Katarina. You can lean into things like the Juggernaut, which is this activated by the Warwick, which enables Samira. So now you have Noxus, Challenger, Juggernaut. Don't forget that it's also not a bad idea just to keep adding more Noxus units, because the more rounds you win, the stronger all your Noxans get. If you end up hitting a Katarina on Carousel at 5, you can go ahead and just play the Katarina. That might encourage you to take out Swain and play Echo for a bit. You can use these Zon mods to temporarily stabilize your boards, plus you get that Rogue synergy. And then inevitably you go to 6 and you try to get everything online. And then say these are your core 5 units that you play around, you can finally get to Kale at 6, so you can play around Slayers this way. So if you have 4 Slayers at 6, you're very likely to keep streaking. But if you don't have the Slayer crest and say instead you're playing around Noxus instead, you can feel free to play 6 Noxus on 6. I'd be cutting Warwick, Zed, playing Cassio, Swain, and Samira. This is totally fine to play. I think a lot of people feel tempted to get something like a Juggernaut on Darius or a Rogue on Katarina, but remember, 6 Noxus, you're usually fighting with so much extra stats. Every unit gets 300 health, 20 AP, 20 AD, plus the 40, 50, 60% bonus that you get for winning against opponents. It's a lot of stats, and just by having those extra Noxus units, you'll realize that even just having, say, like a 1-star Swain can almost look like he's a 2-star unit. If you do end up going this line, if you have Darius as your carry, then you play around Warwick as on 7, and you roll for Darius 3. If you play around Katarina, then your next unit could probably be Zed instead, so you get that Rogue and a little bit of extra power on Kled from Slayer. And you're going to be staying at 7 for a really long time, but if you go to 8 and you're able to, once again, find a way to play 6 Noxus and even find a Slayer emblem on Katarina, you can go ahead and play Gwen at 8. You can activate that Slayer, slowly but surely cut the weak Noxus, go for things like Aatrox, tech back in Kale somehow, and the Swain could be anything. In the ideal scenario, if you're playing for a really capped out board, you end up going for Senna, so that way you get the Shadow Isles. Make sure you position things like your Aatrox next to your Darius, so you get the 80 bonus. Remember, if you're playing Rogue for Katarina, you want to generally keep the Rogue somewhere between the 2nd and 5th hex, because that way it can dash to the corner when the Rogue activates. Or rather, if the Rogue activates, sometimes your Katarina and Zed will grief you. The really cool thing is that you can both utilize Noxus and Slayer emblems, or even Juggernaut emblems. Gwen is actually one of the best emblem holders just in the game, period. So if you just give her things like the extra Noxus, the extra Juggernaut, and as a result go to 6 Noxus, 4 Juggernaut and beyond, you end up getting a lot of value off of the Gwen. Usually some green lights to play this comp is if you start off with something like a Slayer's Crest, you can get that +1 Slayer. Slayer is both good on Darius and Katarina, so just play according to what you're hitting. Slayer's Resolve is very good, and remember that this is basically like a Titan's Resolve, so you can afford to stack more offensive items if you get Slayer's Resolve. Unified Resistance is really good because you line everything up in the front 2 rows anyways, so you get all that armor and MR, and that healing will make it more effective HP. Then don't forget that you can also play things like Long Distance Pals, Gifts of the Fallen, the traditional combat augments that are really good. Let's start talking about some underplayed comps that are really strong in this meta, depending on your start. Remember that a lot of comps in this section will be conditional, and I'll explain how to get them. The first is 8 Void. I think a lot of people thought that with the nerf to Baron Nashor, that's going to be a lot weaker, but it turns out that 8 Void is actually even stronger because your mid game is much better or playing around 6 Void in the Rift Herald. The power of this composition is that you're strong early because Void gives you a lot of stats. If you hit 6 Void on curve, you also continue to tempo, and that allows you to fast 8, which is pretty rare currently in the game. And another cool thing is that it's kind of like the Ionia core, which is you can just kind of slam any kind of items that make sense as long as it keeps your tempo curve, because the most important thing is to get to 8 Void as soon as possible and find that Bel'Veth. So the first priority is to just get that +1 Void somehow, whether it's through the augment or through a tome. I think rolling on 6 is actually pretty important in this composition because you can hit 6 Void based off hitting that Cho'Gath, Rek'Sai, Kassadin, Malzahar, Vel'Koz +1. But also, more importantly, you want to collect those units so you have them. As you continue to level up, it's going to be really difficult to find these 1 and 2 cost units. And then the third thing is take something that's economic facing so you can get that Bel'Veth as soon as possible. Whether it's an econ augment, something that helps you find higher tier units like Median Men Shopping, just figure out a way to get to that level 8 with as much gold so you can find that Bel'Veth or pick it off carousel. I think that Bel'Veth is a big reason why 8 Void is a lot better now because she is buffed to actually be very strong if you get attack speed items on her. Her best item, without a doubt, is Rapid Fire Cannon because it just gives her that raw attack speed and gives her more range to be safe. And Giant Slayer helps her bust through tanks. With Kai'Sa, you could justify 10 different items on her. You can go Shiv, Guardbreaker, Archangels. You can go Shojin, Deathcap, Jewel Gauntlet. Just put any kind of AP items that make sense. The Void Emblem holder can just be any challenger, so you can tag with Kai'Sa. A lot of people put on Yasuo for the CC. You could put on Callista, and Callista could also be a potential thing you roll for as an out if you say get to 8 and you just roll for Callista 3, Rek'Sai 3, and Bel'Veth. A lot of times, people put Baron Nashor in the front line and just let it take aggro, but currently with really high DPS targets like Lux in the meta, you don't want Baron Nashor to take aggro. So I actually highly recommend putting him in the second row, or some people choose to actually put him completely in the back and try to have Baron Nashor be just another ranged carry. Another thing to consider is how Kai'Sa can sometimes end up getting herself into trouble through things like Jarvan. The reason why I positioned like this is because when Kai'Sa first casts, she's going to dash away from this clump of units, so that way units like Jarvan are not going to target it. Kai'Sa casting is really important, so make sure to position her in a way that she doesn't get shrouded, she doesn't get Zephyr, she doesn't get CC'd. Remember, if you don't have Kai'Sa or Bel'Veth in the fight, you're just relying only on Baron, and that's just not going to be super consistent right now. So try to protect them at all costs. The best part about build-up for this composition is just how easy it is to play as well. You start off with Void Sorcerers, so you can play like Orianna, and remember, keep her in the front line because Orianna wants to shield, and then that shield does damage. Also, make sure to try not to sell any of the Void units because you might need to come back for them. Always hold like an extra copy if you end up trying to use them as an item holder. At level 5, you try to get in 4 Sorc, so you find this Vel'Koz finally. And maybe instead of Cho'Gath, you temporarily take him out to play a Turk. But then you keep him on your bench, and at level 6, you ultimately just go for 6 Void, which is boom, boom. And who else do we want? We can just put in Teemo, I guess. There you go. And that's your level 6. At level 7, you actually have a lot of options. Let's say you don't find Kai'Sa. Let's say you just find this Azir. Azir can totally just hold these items in a 6 Void core. So you just give him the Shiv and Deathcap and Gunblade. So now you're starting to notice that Azir also kind of blends into this tree as well with Lux. So if you do find a scenario where, let's say instead of this Teemo, you find Lux, you can actually just play Azir Lux carry for a while. Because let's say you go to 8 and you just can't find the Bel'Veth, you can't find the Kai'Sa because they're super hard to find. You can just play something like this for a long time until you're able to actually get those units. This is ultimately the hardest part about playing the comp, which is what happens if you don't hit the units. You have to have good backup plans of what you can flex into if you don't find Bel'Veth and Kai'Sa in some of the most contested units. Going over the augments, pretty much your augment has to be a +1 Void. I would highly recommend against trying to play this composition if you don't have a +1 Void, because then you're not able to get the Baron Nashor. Stable Evolution is still really strong, even though it got nerfed, and also gives you the early Void units, so it just gives you early game, just like that. And don't forget, like any kind of econ augments, medium end shopping, you can also go for anything that just gives you gold, anything that gives you EXP, something that just helps you find Bel'Veth a lot easier without having to just nuke your entire economy. They recently buffed the Warwick carry augment, Ravenous Hunter, and it is actually incredibly strong if you get a star first, so I wanted to highlight it. Ravenous Hunter says that when your strongest Warwick takes damage, he gets 6% attack damage and ability power, back up to 50 times, which is so many stats. So basically, Warwick just gets 300 AD and AP and armor and magic resistance, which is just, what? The key to this composition is 1, hit the augment, 2, focus on Warwick augments, and 3, just slow roll on 6 for Warwick. But I think what people misunderstand is they think that they want to go for a lot of challengers and get all the attack speed, but in reality, what makes Warwick really difficult to deal with is the vertical juggernauts. The 7 core units are the 4 Challenger, the 4 Juggernaut, and the Ionia. Sometimes you don't have Aatrox, so instead of Aatrox, we'll just play Garen for now. In terms of the Zon mods, pretty much no matter what, you're going to always put it on Warwick, but if you have Robotic Arm, that is really good on Warwick because they now have buffed it to trigger additional attacks, which just stacks up things like the Rage Blade and his Ravenous Hunter that much quicker. Exoskeleton's also really good with Warwick because healing that 10% is really good with all those resistances that you'll be stacking with your augment. Shimmer Injector is really good for that 35% healing, plus just gives you that base attack speed, which is not bad. If you have Unstable Chem Tank and Virulent Bioware, I would consider probably cutting the Zon. Not that you have to, but instead, you can just play a higher quality unit instead. Maybe, for example, you hit like a random Heimerdinger, so you just play the Heimerdinger. That's just like one of many examples. If you do hit a +1 Juggernaut, get 6 Juggernaut in ASAP because it is very, very good. The QSS is also really important on Warwick. I think people will probably prioritize Bloodthirster and Rageblade first, but with Quicksilver, it makes Warwick guaranteed to ramp up that attack speed because he doesn't get interrupted from all the CC that's available in the set. Position, you can pretty much just straight front row everything. Put Warwick in the corner so that way he's a little bit safer and not necessarily stuck on a tank. The worst thing for Warwick would be to get stuck on a super tank like a Sejuani or a Shen. And then also you'd make sure Warwick's not targeted by Lux. We kind of mentioned this in other parts of the video, but Warwick can get shredded down really quickly before he's able to get those stacks up. Build out of this comp is actually pretty straightforward. Usually you just start with the 3 Ionia plus Warwick. And you're probably not actually going to win a lot because this is not very strong early unless you 2-star everything. Usually what ends up happening with this comp is I see a lot of people actually just try to open for it because they want to stabilize hard on the 3-2 roll down. That's a possibility that you can play with it. I prefer to just kind of play straight up, but some people want to make sure that they have as much gold as possible to hit Warwick 2 and stabilize and then try to hit Warwick 3 as fast as they can. You can play Irelia, set Warwick Jhin. At 5, just taking another challenger like Samira. And at 6, you can go ahead and play Callista. You can also just play Juggernauts, although I think it's less good because of how expensive they are. But this is totally a viable way that you can get to 6 as well. And remember, you do want to stay at 6 ultimately to reroll for Warwick 3 and Set 3. Those are the 2 costs that you end up going for the most often. It's pretty rare to 3-star, especially Garen and Darius. You're not really going to be going for those at all. I have a sneaking suspicion that Ionia Emblem might be okay with Warwick in this composition, but generally people don't do that, so feel free to experiment if you really want to. And then once you get to 7, you're rolling for things like that Kaisa. This Jhin comes out and the Yasuo goes in instead. Eventually you find Nasus, you take out Garen. Garen's the weakest Juggernaut right now currently in the game. And ideally you eventually get to Aatrox. Aatrox is very, very solid. Cut the Darius and voila. You get the Urgots, and now you have the Zon back in. By the way, I mentioned that Juggernaut Emblem is good on Yasuo, but you could totally put it on Urgot as well, assuming that it's a spot where it makes sense for it. If you get 2 Juggernaut Emblems, maybe you just do that. In terms of the augments, it's pretty straightforward. Just take anything that synergizes with Warwick directly outside the Ravenous Hunter. The +1 Juggernaut Crest, we mentioned. The Adrenaline Rush is really good. Anything that heals or gives shields is really strong. Long Distance Pals is also particularly really good. So just generally anything that's combat oriented. You can also justify taking something that helps you hit the Warwick really fast, like a Think Fast on 3-2 to hit Warwick 3. That's a guaranteed top 2. This variation of challengers is actually one of my favorite comps in the game currently, which is playing around Shadow Isles and trying to flex around the emblem. The cool thing about this composition is how strong a package specifically Gwen, Senna, and Aatrox are, because it gives you Slayer through the Gwen and the Aatrox, and it gives you the Shadow Isles versus the Senna and a ton of utility, plus damage to any other AD carry, aka Yasuo. Remember that Yasuo wants to be same side as Aatrox because of the Darken bonus. Yasuo, because he has Shadow Isle emblem, is actually going to be casting a lot, so you don't actually need Edge of Night nearly as much as you think so, because he's going to be getting in and out of places really fast, especially if you have something like Rapid Fire Cannon, which extends the range of his last breath. This is a comp where actually people mistake to play around Kai'Sa. Gwen is actually the main carry alongside Yasuo as secondary, and Kai'Sa just holds any support damage that you can just give her AP or Shiv. And also another condition that you can go for is Kalista 3, because again, Kalista is just a really solid unit to roll for, especially if you're playing on 7. The reason why it's so strong to add a bunch of 5 costs in this composition is because Shadow Isles is just really versatile. Who doesn't want an 80% health shield and 12 mana every second? Pretty much every unit in the game. And so you don't necessarily have to put Shadow Isle emblem on Yasuo. You can totally put it on Kai'Sa if you're just hitting Kai'Sa 2. Or let's say you don't have Aatrox and Shen because they're too expensive. You're just playing Set and Nasus. You can play the Shadow Isle emblem on Nasus as well and give him a bunch of tank items. The emblem is just very, very versatile, and you have so many different options that you can use to try and get some tempo and snowball your lead. In general, I try to also same side Kalista and Gwen because I really want Gwen and Kalista to snipe things pretty quickly in tandem and then move on to the rest of the units. The faster Gwen can get past the front liner, the quicker she can get to the back line. So your initial build-ups kind of look something like this, where you play around Viego and Maokai early, and then ideally at 5 you can get Kalista because you have this +1 Shadow Isles, so you can get it up as soon as you can. And now with 4 Shadow Isles, you can pretty much just play whatever you want to flex into that last spot. So if you hit another challenger, you can play Warwick, for example. Let's say you're turbo high rolling, you hit an early Shen. That gives you an opportunity to tech in Ionia instead because you hit Karma Shen, and now all of a sudden you have a really stable mid game. And then at 7 you can add something like Gwen, and you're rolling at Gwen for a board like this. Slowly but surely start replacing some of these units. So let's say you find Kai'Sa and Yasuo, it can just go in over Zed. Shadow Emblem can go here. If you have Yasuo 1 and Kai'Sa 1, I'm pretty sure Yasuo is better with the Shadow Isles because he benefits from the shield and the mana, versus Kai'Sa just kind of benefits from the mana. And don't forget, of course, Irelia can go into here as well, the Karma. And this is a pretty fine level 7 to play around if you end up hitting all this stuff. Because Kai'Sa and Yasuo are so contested, you gotta be prepared for what ends up happening if you don't end up hitting them. So instead, play around an Ionia core and then maybe flex around potential like Gwen Slayers. Maybe Zed just comes in here and then you just keep around Kale or whatever, and you just play around the Slayers plus the Shadow Isles for a bit. In this example, you'd probably put Shadow Isle emblem on Shen so that he gets a little bit extra HP and shield. Another possibility is just playing around Karma because she also can just be holding a bunch of AP items. I think Karma in general is a pretty underrated AP carry, so don't be afraid to just jam things onto Karma if you need. This is an example of how you can play 6 Shadow Isles on a level 7 board if you don't hit things like Yasuo and that Kai'Sa, and it's really cheap, so it's really convenient. Some combat augments that you think about is the Shadow Isle Crest, obviously, because you need that to play that +1. Otherwise, I wouldn't advise going for 4 Shadow Isles because you have to play a Maokai or a Viego, and that's pretty weak. Also want to note that 6 Shadow Isles is very good, but kind of hard to fit unless you have a second Shadow Isle Crest, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend just jamming 6 Shadow Isle Crest unless you know what you're doing. The reasons being is that Viego and Maokai are just 1-cost units that have no real tie and synergy, so you're just gonna have to play a weaker board with lower tier units. But 6 Shadow Isles is still really good, so if you're able to play from ahead, definitely go for it. Gifts of the Fallen is particularly really strong because it just makes one of these carries potentially 1v9. I've seen so many times Gwen able to go up against an army of units and then win, or even Yasuo or Kai'Sa. And you want a bunch of flat stats because you get so much HP and mana, so you want to get some extra damage so you can compensate for it. Another really good augment actually is Unified Resistance because you get so much of that Shadow Isle shield, so that resistance will make that shield even better. Sorcerers are actually another comp that I really like to play, and it's not even necessarily something that you need a +1 sorcerer for, but it helps a lot if you're able to get that emblem. Mainly because you're able to fit everything in on 7. If you have the sorcerer emblem, you can hit everything on 7 without having to go to 8, so you can get the 3 Demacia, the 6 sorcerer, and the Jarvan in as part of the front line. The best user of sorcerer emblem is Sona usually, but in the rare instance where you don't have the ability to have that, or you have an extra one, just put it on Jarvan. There's nothing funnier actually than watching Jarvan somehow do like 2,000 damage in a single cast and almost killing the backline carry. The reason why I like this composition is because 1, you only need to roll for Lux and not like Lux, Azir, Jarvan, Nasus as a 4 cost. And 2, it's a composition that you can roll for at 6 so that you have more options instead of just trying to wait for the game to get to stage 4 so you can roll down as much as you can on level 7. At level 6, you're trying to roll for things like the Swain, the Malzahar, the Taric, the Vel'Koz, the Sona maybe, and then trying to play around that Void Core. Remember that sorcerers already give you a lot of raw ability power, so things like Death Cap, Archangels are not actually very good in this composition. Instead, you want something that amplifies that, so a critical strike such as the Jewel Gauntlet is really, really valuable. Gunblade, Giant Slayer, Hodge, these are all also very usable things. Also, please do not forget that you need mana sources of some kind. A lot of times people end up playing things like blue buff on Vel'Koz or Shojin on Sona. Don't be afraid to put Shojin on Lux either, because you can have all the AP in the world, but if you never cast, it doesn't matter. Sometimes actually does want to be positioned next to a carry so she can buff the attack speed with her cast of Crescendo. And so you want to put her next to Vel'Koz, Lux, whoever ends up holding all your items. However, this does make you more vulnerable to clumping. So if you want to make it 50-50, you can try to do something like this. That way, it feels like if their enemy Jarvan is down the center, it could go left or right. Positioning of the front line is really tight because Taric's Radiance affects the adjacent allies. So you don't want to separate too much and you want to have Taric keep Swain alive. The best item that Swain could hold early is getting things like Ionic Spark. So make sure you prioritize that as soon as you can. That's so important. I'm going to change in the middle of this video. Ionic Spark. Actually, it's not just Ionic Spark, it's actually just Shred. Magic Shred. That's the most important thing right now. I see too many people just build like damage items and tank items and then not have Shred and then wonder why their AP units don't deal damage. Get that Spark, maybe Shiv. Shiv is a little bit worse than sorcerers because you have to wait for them to auto attack before you get the magic resistance shred, but still better than nothing. At level 8, get that Ahri in and you can probably take out the Malzahar by now. And just get more frontline like Shen, for example, for the Bastion. Another really underrated unit is actually K'Sante, because K'Sante might be able to clutch certain things and kick important frontliners that stop Lux and Vel'Koz from popping off. Also, if you're in a situation where you can play 8 sorcerers, you should definitely do it. In this instance, I would probably consider cutting Sona, so I can go for 8 sorcerers as fast as I can. And then instead I put the Sorcerer Emblem on Jarvan. But generally speaking, you usually only go for 8 sorcerers if you have 2, because as you notice, it really sucks to not have the Demacia, and you really want to have that multicaster on the Vel'Koz. So if you do end up going for 8 sorcerers, usually something you play at level 9, or if you have a second Sorcerer Emblem. Let's talk about build-up of how you get there. Starting from level 4, you want to play around a Void Core. Ideally, you get something like Taric with Cassid and Malzahar, so you have a really tanky front line, but you can't find Taric because he's expensive early. You just can go ahead and play Orianna and Swain. And then maybe you find the Vel'Koz instead to play over the Cho'Gath, and now all of a sudden you have 4 Sorcerer, 3 Void. At level 6, try to play for Taric. Taric in general is just really, really important. Try not to sell him even early if you do get him dropped out of a box and you want to be playing Sorcerers. And the cool thing is, at level 6, you might just have 6 Sorc if you just find the emblem, and you can just play it like this. And 6 Sorc is one of the big jumps. You don't want to play 4 Sorcs and flex other traits, because if you look, the 80 ability power and shock 2 enemies for 12%. So you double that shock, which is actually quite a lot of damage. So 6 sorcerers is that breakpoint. And then from here at level 7, you just find Lux, take out the Orianna, and then you go for that Sona. And you can just play this at level 7 for a while until you find Jarvan. Eventually, when you find Jarvan, Kassadin comes out, and then the Sorcerer Emblem goes back onto Sona. And there you go. Best combat augment, in my opinion, for sorcerers is Overcharged Mana Front, because it gives you the mana. It's a lot weaker than it was since it got nerfed in the previous patch, but it's still really good, and it gives you mana sources, so it doesn't feel like you're super dependent on having things like the Shojin and blue buffs. Make no mistake, though, if you do end up getting it, it's not like having mana items plus mana font is actually bad. Sorcerer Crest, pretty straightforward. You want to get that Sorcerer +1. Things like Magic Wand is also pretty reliable, but you don't really need it because you get a lot of AP already. In fact, I think it's actually better to go for something like Jeweled Lotus instead, because then all of your things crit, and then instead of playing Jewel Gauntlet, you can go for Guard Breaker. And it's almost like Lux has that Jewel Gauntlet already, so she has that bonus crit as well as the Guard Breaker to amplify that damage. Same thing for Vel'Koz. Say you go for Vel'Koz 3, you get him with the Hand of Justice, blue buff, Giant Slayer. Jarvan's items in this comp is very important for him to cast and not necessarily tank. So if you want to go for a Jarvan item, make sure you try to get Protector's Vow as fast as you can. And then Swain holds everything because as a sorcerer, he buffs himself. So Swain ends up holding all of your defensive items. Swain 3 is actually pretty legit in this composition. Very, very strong. But the problem with Swain is that a lot of people will be contesting him because he's a strategist and he goes into the Azir Lux trees. So you're probably not going to be able to 3-star Swain currently on this patch. In the future, though, if Swain is less contested, it's something to think about. If you're stuck rolling on 7, you can try to chase Swain 3 and hold all the Swains that you get. Taric 3 is less reliable. I would highly advise against going against Taric because it feels like a gold sink, but in some rare scenarios, let's say you're stuck on like Swain pair, but you have 6 Tarics or whatever, yeah, you could chase Taric 3 and then just move all your items to him. The reason being is because Taric generally wants to be sandwiched. He doesn't want to be on the outside taking the aggression. And so it's kind of weird if you have Taric like here, for example, and you don't get value, or at least you don't get as much value. Even more than the Azir comp, Lux positioning matters a lot. So make sure this Lux is sniping the appropriate units. If they're playing that giant Warwick 3, if they're playing like really huge Darius, if they're playing like a really strong tank, make sure Lux is safe and nuking that target. So there you have it. The 4 comps that's currently the most popular and strong in the metagame, as well as 4 ways that you can play off meta slightly or a lot, depending on your spot. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.